As to the first question, who's responsible for protection of springs? I think there's a dual role with DEP and the water management districts. DEP regulates a lot of the water quality and contaminant discharges. That falls under their regulatory jurisdiction. And so if you're talking about water quality, regulation of discharges that might end up in springs, then that would be DEP for the most part. There's a small component that's done by the water management districts, but by far the majority of the permitting of things like wastewater facilities, industrial discharges done by DEP. Water management districts have responsibility for what's called a consumptive use permitting program. That's, say, the permitting of all of those withdrawals that Bob was talking about just a few minutes ago. That program has been in place at all the water management districts for several decades now. It is specifically for the permitting of withdrawals, either from groundwater or surface water that meet certain thresholds. Usually the larger the user, the more rigorous the permitting process is going to be. So the permitting of the actual withdrawals, the water quantity, is done by the water management districts. Then in addition to that, the water management districts have a long history of doing restoration projects. South Florida Water Management District all the way up through the Northwest Florida Water Management District. The legislature had a restoration project, a certain water body. It absolutely positively had to get done. It went through water management districts because we had a long, long history of being able to get things done, especially when it came to engineering projects where we were trying to restore a water body. That was the case up until about 6 years ago. And I think back through the years, I was at the Water Management District from 1977 through 2012 in just about every position that you can imagine, all the way up through executive director. But I started out so far down the totem pole I couldn't see the top back in 1977. And that's kind of my background, technical background, by the way. I can remember the governors that we've had through the years: Bob Graham, Lawton Childs, Jeb Bush, and those that followed, even some of those may have been only in office for 4 years. I remember that they tried, made every effort they could to protect the springs and the bays and the rivers throughout Northwest Florida and the rest of the state, thinking about Everglades in particular. But that changed about 6 years ago with the election of our current governor. I hate to put it so bluntly, but that in fact is the case. Since early on, the districts went through a series of what I think are setbacks. They suffered some very, very serious reductions in their funding from ad valorem. Particularly, I'm thinking of South Florida Water Management District, St. John's, and Southwest, bigger districts that had a very substantial part of their budget coming from ad valorem, and that was seriously cut back. Even Northwest, those who don't know the history, our millage was set at 0.05 mils. About 1/20th of the other water management districts, and even we had to take a small cutback in the amount. So small, in fact, I couldn't believe it when the current Secretary of DEP, who at the time was the one who had to call me and say, well, we want you to take a reduction in your taxes. And I just thought to myself, you're kidding. Because ours was so small that it was of no consequence. But at the bigger districts, that was certainly very, very consequential, and they've been suffering from that setback and don't really think they've recovered since then. A few of the other things that I've seen that transpired, some of which I was personally knowledgeable about, and others that I've observed, the Department of Environmental Protection now is exercising, particularly the Secretary, tighter control over the districts than had ever occurred in the past. And that we can particularly see with the selection of springs projects that go forward for restoration purposes. Typically, in the past, that would have been districts making that determination and going to their boards and getting approval. That's no longer the case, from what I can tell. Now, those decisions are made by DEP and the water management districts, and I'm thinking that it's more DEP than the water management districts. The districts are just simply doing what they're being told. I can see that some of the other consequences of what's transpired over the last few years. I think that the boards have been governing boards who previously really are the ones who the staff had to go to and plead their case on everything that they did, from funding, permitting, etc. The boards have now been marginalized, and that's probably probably a kind way of putting it. I've even seen board meetings that have lasted, full board meeting, from start to finish, 5 minutes. 15 minutes at the particular district that I'm talking about is common. 30 minutes is probably getting out towards the max. Thank you. A few other things, and I think I'll pass on the slides because I don't think I'm going to have time. Finally, I think I'm going to say to wrap this up, since she's flashing the cards at me.
This is her job.
Yes, I know. I've had that job in the past. Okay. The final thing I'm going to say, though, is really now is the time that we need organizations like the Springs Institute. Bob, I know Bob just recently released another report on Ocala Springs, another really good report. But it's organizations like that and the other private activist-oriented organizations that we really need now, because nobody's watching the board management district. Sometimes I'm the only one that shows up for a board meeting. Go to those board meetings and let your voice be heard. I think you're more important now than you ever have been in the past. And with that, I think I'll end. If there's a little bit of time, I'll maybe show you an example of a spring restoration project that it is not going to work. It's unfortunate. One high point, though, that I do want to mention. The legislature, the last several years, has been appropriating funds for springs restoration. That's the high point. An action by the legislature to put in $50 million or so a year for springs restoration isn't enough, some would argue, but it's something. And I think that really is the high point when I think about springs restoration over the last few years. And that, I think, has resulted from some members in positions of authority in the legislature who really, really think a lot about springs, really, really love springs. And it takes a few, especially if they're chairs of committees, to make things happen. The problem, very quickly, though, is there's a long history of water management districts of things being funded for a few years, and then there's legislative turnover and attention is turned elsewhere. The SWIM program, Preservation 2000, Florida Forever, all of those programs were around for a short period of time, and then the legislature turned their attention elsewhere. So we have to make the maximum, absolute maximum of the funding we're making available to the districts through DEP right now, because it could go away at any time.